Hey guys, Joe here with Damon Smith to talk about shamanism from the ground up. This week it's going to be a little bit shorter, seeing as we are well underway with learning stage 2 of shamanism, and we've talked about it so much and really hammered home how fundamentally important it is. This week we are going to do a quick recap on Chalicity. So for those who are just joining us, these podcasts are an encyclopedic knowledge base on shamanism. But most importantly, how to be a shaman. Not just think about it and rationalize it, but put ourselves at the center of shamanism. Use it for real and not fall into the very, very easy trap of delusion, which seems to be just rife wherever you look. The way we protect ourselves from this delusion is using the fundamental foundation of shamanic technique, which is Chalicity, or approaching shamanistic technique in a state of Chalicity. So Damon, I know we have talked at length about Chalicity in various different episodes, mainly episodes 7, 8, and 9.
Yeah.
But as seen as it really is so crucial to learning shamanism, I think a quick recap is a pretty good idea. So we can split Chalicity into 3 components. We've got Bat, Toshaltine, and Guchach. We focus on each of these separately in episodes 7, 8, and 9 respectively. But do you think if someone is just starting out, it's best to focus on the first component, Bat?
I don't rank the components of Chalicity, but I think there's something in what you're suggesting. First of all, I think something that's worth pointing out is I think that hopefully now we've done a couple of episodes on Mamsker, that the reason why we've been harping on about Chalicity for all this time, pretty much since the very first episode, has immediately become apparent. Because what you hopefully seen is, these techniques, the Amskar techniques, are not really achievable without it. For both the techniques we've looked to in detail, to date for Amskar, you could say 3 with the Tillen exercise. But just take the 2. The first thing that we've said about each of these techniques is first achieve a state of Chalicity, then ... whatever the technique is. And as we've said in shamanism, it's not about learning things on the baseline like we do in our society. There's a huge focus on, we go to school, we go to university, some of us, and we
think about things
in our minds, and it's not that kind of learning. Obviously, there's some of that kind of learning involved in shamanism, and the Woven Energy podcast is probably an example of that. But much more important is the learning on the midline, and learning in the top line, which is like the trunk of the world tree and the branches and leaves of the world tree. And
incidentally, we have looked at that with episode 2, actually, very early on. That's, the 3 realms of shamanism,
Yeah. That was your idea to do those that early, and I think it was a good idea as it panned out.
Well, we talk about these 3 realms an awful lot, and we talk about them in terms of the roots, the trunk, and the leaves, the baseline, midline, top line. There's so many interchanging words that I think it could get a bit confusing.
Yeah,
so if people are confused, episode 2 is where to go for that one.
Yeah, I think it is a fairly legitimate place to start, especially because of the format that we're using here. You could say it's an extremely untraditional format or non-traditional format that we're using. But I don't think that getting the 3 realms covered off quite quickly was a good idea. So if anybody, it's probably worth going back to that podcast as a bit of a refresher. Is it worth focusing on Bat when you're completely starting out with Chalicity? Possibly. I think that the suggestion, probably a better suggestion, would be that don't worry about Guchach. That would probably be a fairly sensible suggestion for somebody starting out on Chalicity. I really, really wouldn't like to, although we addressed it ahead of Toshaltine, I personally wouldn't place any more importance on Bat than I would place on Toshaltine in terms of Chalicity. Toshaltine is absolutely vital to shamanism, every bit as vital as Bat.
So we can practically work on our bat and our toshalteen, but guchach will work on itself by working on those two. Is that?
Especially if we approach our shamanism in a sensible way. What I mean by a sensible way is we are aware of the pitfall of imagination, and if we constantly and sincerely do our best not to fall into the imagination trap, then probably not worrying about guchach when you start out is probably a fairly decent idea. The thing with guchach, of course, is guchach has that immediacy. It has that, guchach is very, very closely related to the reality of the universe. And you won't build. The issue is if you forget that and you do fall into the imagination trap, as many people do, sincerely, not intending to, but sincerely, if you fall into the imagination trap, then your guchach honestly won't build, and that's the real worry with a guchach comes over a long period of time. But if you fall into the imagination trap with shamanism, it won't come at all. And that would be that's why I think it's important to mention guchach right from the outset. Yeah. Because the guchach you think you're building, if you do fall into the imagination trap, is actually your own miasma. You're actually creating your own kind of mini miasma as you proceed into your shamanism, and that miasma will be no different from the miasma that's imposed on you by your society, by whatever circumstance you find yourself in. It will be the same, and it will be just as big a blocker, if not more so, to your progress with shamanism as the miasma that's been imposed on you through social circumstance, if you like.
Yeah.
But yeah, a bat is absolutely vital to Chalicity, but all I would say is so too is toshalteen. Yes.
Well, we've said a few times that Chalicity is a mode or a state of being that we can put ourselves in, and that when we've achieved Chalicity, it's very obvious. We'll know it. Is that correct?
It is a very, very obvious state. I think that because it's so tightly tied to reality, as when we were talking about Bulking Hengreg, for instance, we addressed the changes in the breath. When you're in a state of Chalicity, you don't need to be thinking about what your breath is, because your breath is part of the reality of the situation. It's self-evidently obvious what it is when you're in a state of Chalicity. And then, as we talked about more advanced, or not really advanced, but, a progression of the Bulking Hengreg technique, your heart rate. Well, I think that, when you go into a state of Chalicity, your heart rate, if you're really in a state of Chalicity, your heart rate is just as obvious as your breathing. And the beat of your heart, because it's part of the reality of you. It's part of the reality of what you are. And I do think that there are people who go through life, without ever addressing that part of themselves, that vitally important part of themselves is the rhythm, their rhythm. Your heart is the main rhythm in your body. It's absolutely vital, and in terms of how your body works, also your heart extends throughout your whole body. The impulse of your heart is extended through the circulatory system throughout your whole body. So your heart is effectively your heart and your breathing are things, as we said, for the Amskar stage of learning shamanism, if you want to call it a stage, they're our way in. And the two things are tightly related to each other. And what we're trying to do is understand the energy in our bodies. Well, those two things are things that extend, their effects extend throughout our bodies, and they're things that are part of the reality of our living, of our being. And so when I say it's obvious, there's a test. Is your heartbeat obvious to you in that state? If it's completely obvious to the point where you don't have to think about it, then definitely I would say you're in a state of Chalicity. And obviously that's verifiable, you know.
Do we post-rationalize it then afterwards? Because when we're in a state of Chalicity, there's no thought for the future, there's no thinking of the past.
Exactly.
We come away with a feeling, yeah?
Yeah, and I think again, you know, your suggestion that is BAT the place to start. BAT has a certain discipline to it. And that discipline is kind of important. You know, the exercise standing at the edge of a lake or the sea, in the teart position. We can use that word now, we've introduced it.
Yeah.
Rather than saying the follow the photograph on the website kind of thing. And you know, if you look at photographs of shamanism, you will see people in that position. That, you know, taking everything equally, you'll find if you start using the roots of the tree too much, you will inevitably end up focusing in on different things, you know, the ripples on the water, or the birds flying across the sky, or the sound of the wind, and as soon as all that is all obvious to you, it's all coming equally, it's all equally there, then you're in a state of Chalicity. You're not focusing in on any of it, and yet you're totally aware of all of it. You're not cutting it off in some way. So what I'm saying is you're not coming to the state of Chalicity by cutting off the outside world and going into some sort of deep meditative state whereby there is no sensory information. Just the opposite. You cease to place importance or judgments or conclusions or opinions or even focus on any individual part of the sensory information, but rather it all comes to you. It's all there. It's all obvious. When you're in that state, yes, it's a very obvious state, but it's not obvious in terms of, I think about it in the roots of the tree and then I note that it's obvious as a conclusion to you're in it. Yeah. You're in it. And there's a great test. You know, we said this stuff's all verifiable. There's a great test. Have you achieved I wouldn't say that the greatest level of Chalicity or anything. Have you achieved an acceptably decent level of Chalicity? Well, in that state, if you want to hit the drum, or if the drum is going to be struck at the same time as your heart beats, then you know you're in a state of Chalicity, unless you've got some sort of heart rate monitor strapped to you, you know, or you're taking your pulse while somehow simultaneously hitting the drum. If you know what your pulse is, then there's a certain degree of Chalicity there.
I can imagine that it's given the society that most of us grow up in, which is so heavily focused on judgments and opinions, and I can imagine that achieving the state of Chalicity is quite a difficult thing. So that might be something we need to put across in this podcast, that it will take time, it will take discipline, it's basically getting rid of everything that's happened to you since birth and being thrust into this strange world.
And what I would say is that problem is there for all shamans. That problem is there for everybody who wants to be a shaman in the world. But for us, as members of a settled, civilized, highly miasmatic society, a society that not only has a incredibly strong miasma, but a society that in some ways doesn't always see the miasma as a bad thing, even its negative aspects. So for us, it's, you know, if we go back to the Altai Mountains, even 1,000 years ago, and we're members of a tribal group there, and we go out hunting and pretty much that's the way we make our living, then we would still have a miasma within our society, but it would be so much easier to deal with than the one that we have today, that, you know, it would be necessary for us to practice the first level of shamanism, of course, but it's way more necessary now than it ever was. And you could call that difference in degree of the need for Chalicity, or the need to practice Chalicity, work harder on it. You could say that is actually the foundation of esotericism. That's the difference. You know, in some ways I've said shamanism is a higher bar than esotericism. But in other ways, that esotericism is a higher bar than shamanism, because esotericism sets out to deal with this crazy, strong, powerful miasma that we have in these kind of societies that we've created.
To simplify this then, I mean, and obviously knowing there's nuance to this, but with wild animals that obviously don't grow up in civilized and settled societies, can we look at a wild animal locked into its surroundings and see Chalicity there? I mean, I always like the goshawk analogy, flying through the undergrowth, you know. And,
it's testable, isn't it, if you're a goshawk?
Yeah.
And
or even the tiger on the hunt, you know.
Absolutely. You know, remember I talked about the wild run? Well, that's very, very similar to what a goshawk. You know, I did the wild run as a test of what I'd learned to that point. But you know, there's a very difference for me doing it as a test of my shamanism to that point.
The wild run
compared
being
to a goshawk who has to do that every single day, day in, day out, year in, year out. And if it makes any kind of mistake, significant mistake, even once, that's its life over. That's incredible, isn't it? That's incredible, you know? And yes, a large part of my shamanism has been wild animals. I almost said the observation of wild animals. I hope that everybody who's got to this point listening to the podcast know why I don't like that phrase, the observation of, because it suggests baseline. Yeah. Has been observing wild animals in a state of Chalicity, taking what they give me in an unfiltered fashion, in the manner of a shaman, and not placing judgments on it, just taking the essence of their flavor, if you like.
So a part of Chalicity, maybe even the whole of Chalicity, is about reconnecting with our aspect of ourselves as animals in a wild environment, just like we see in
exactly. I mean, if you think about it this way, if you think about Chalicity as not as taking something on, but as getting rid of something. You know, we spent 10,000 years building up this thing that we call civilization. And as we said, it has great aspects, and we may address them on other podcasts. But or any of our various other podcasts we fancy addressing on them. But on the Shamanism podcast, obviously, if you think about like this, the possibly maybe like a fossil. You know, there's a fossilized bone in the ground, and it's covered in a lot of dust. You're not going to see the fossil. You're not going to see the bone. The fossil representing where we've come from. You're not going to see the bone by heaping yet more dust on top of that thing. You're going to get to see it by sweeping the dust away. You know, ashiki harai. You know, I think I mentioned ashiki harai. That's literally what it means. Sweep away. Harai means to sweep. Harau is the verb to sweep in Japanese, and ashiki is the miasma. Yeah, sweeping away the miasma. And it is very much like sweeping away dust. The process of achieving Chalicity is like sweeping away the dust, and it's like reality is there inside you. And if you get rid of all the stuff, you get rid of your judgments, your imagination, your values, all of those things, everything you take away. You move closer to the bedrock of what is you. You move closer to the bedrock of what is reality. And you can think about it as once all of that stuff's gone, what's left cannot be anything other than reality, you know, because they're the things that separate you from reality or make you perceive reality in ways other than what is real. So the process of becoming like a chalice, like a bagtamstesab, like a capacious container that's ready to be filled by nature, not by human beings. You know, we're here in shamanism, the world's only religion, in my opinion, the world's only religion that doesn't come from human beings. It's like, it's a great thing. In one of the esoteric groups, who are known as the Rosicrucians, they refer to it as the Book M. They used rather cryptic language, the Rosicrucians. There was good reason for that. If anybody had found out they were a Rosicrucian, they'd probably been tied to a post and burned with great speed. Yeah. So they used a lot of cryptic language, but the M stands for the Latin word mundi.
Yeah.
Religions of a book, a lot of religions, they place importance on these books and what's in them, and it's almost like in order to convert someone to that religion, they start talking to them about what's in that book and convincing them of the truth of that book. But the process is totally based on the assumption that what's in that book it has some reality in it, or has some relation to the truth, if you like. You want to use the word the truth. The difference with shamanism, so that's what a teacher of a religion of a book would do. They could take the book and it doesn't matter which book it is, they could start trying to convince somebody of their religion, of the benefits of their religion by referring to the book. The thing with shamanism is, the great thing with shamanism, it hasn't got a book. It does have books about it, but it doesn't have a book that it's based on, except this thing that the Rosicrucians referred to as the Book M. And of course, M stands for Mundi, which means the world. Yeah. The book of shamanism, the book of esotericism, is the world itself. It's nature. And, you can agree or disagree with the author of, you can agree or disagree with the author of any given particular book. But
I love how careful you're being, Damon.
Yeah, it's usually a good idea when we're talking about exoteric religions to be careful. And talk about esotericism and why esotericism is not very well known in our society, because until very recent times, there are few things more dangerous you could do in your life than become an esotericist.
Yeah.
Until very recent times. But what I'm saying is that, do you criticize the author of the planet Earth, the author of the solar system, the author of the galaxy, the author of all of the galaxies, the author of the universe? To me, that's kind of harder to criticize. We mentioned George Carlin's famous thing when he said he'd become a sun worshipper. Yeah. And,
I'd become a sun worshipper.
It adds
I can see the sun. It adds to the credibility.
And the world and the universe and nature and wild animals, they can be treated in a sort of religious way, if you like, as if they are a book. But the difference between a teacher of shamanism and a teacher of a religion of a book, for instance, is a teacher of religion of a book will refer you to that book for your answers. A teacher of shamanism will only refer you to the book M, the book of the world, with questions. The answers in shamanism always come from nature. Yeah. And shamanism, one of the ways of defining shamanism is putting ourselves, shamanistic technique is putting ourselves in a position where we can gain direct knowledge, feedback, understanding from nature itself without human beings being interposed, without the miasma being interposed directly. All shamanism, in a way, as Mircea Eliade kind of highlights in his very extensive work on the subject, it's just a huge catalogue of techniques that put you in that place where you're gaining feedback, not from your teacher, not from your guide, but from nature itself. And Chalicity is simply the state in which that can be done most effectively.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's all it is. That's all
interesting.
It is.
It's interesting what you said before. You mentioned Baktamshtesal, which of course is the Mongol version of what the word Chalicity. And it's interesting that other more animistic languages and peoples and societies, they have words for Chalicity, and you've had to quote unquote make one up in English because English isn't the best language to describe shamanism. So it's not like what the point I'm trying to make is this isn't made up stuff. This is known in other cultures and other societies around the world, isn't it?
Well, I believe that. My suspicion is that if you went back far enough in the islands that we live in, we can't call it the UK because it wasn't the UK at that time. This is long before it became the UK. But if you go back far enough call it the Isles, if you like, I suspect as recently as 2,000 years ago, perhaps even more recently than that, and you looked at the language of the people who lived here then, I would be willing to put money, it's impossible to know, but I would be willing to put money on a bet that said that those people had a word for Chalicity and had a word for the miasma. I would feel that would be likely. I wouldn't think that they had no miasma because there's no such thing, and they weren't hunter-gatherers. But they were almost certainly, well, we know just from the archaeology, even the archaeology, walking distance from my house, we know that those people were much more animistic than we are. Yeah. I don't think they were probably as animistic as certain hunter-gatherer peoples that are alive in the world today, even, but they were more animistic than we are. And I would bet they would have words for these things. But of course, they didn't speak the language that we speak. The language that we speak has been built by the culture that we live in, and the culture that we will live in has been dominated by a particular religion of a particular book for more than 1,000 years, heavily dominated. And so clearly anything that was in our language that contradicted the faith-based opinions of that religion, they would be dangerous words to use. And therefore, I feel that the words were probably there, and fell into disuse. But that's what I feel.
Fell into disuse, or maybe something a bit more malicious.
Well, it's not. It's not. It depends. It depends what you want, doesn't it? If I was, I wouldn't feel. If I was a person, say 1,000 years ago in the Isles, promoting a religion of a book, I wouldn't see that as malicious at all. And this is what I mean by this stuff. I don't believe a lot of it is malicious. I just believe that it's the imagination trap. It's the lunate sulcus disappearing, and us not being, for one reason, for instance, the need to nap flint into these technological shapes, having an unintended consequence that we can start believing stuff that isn't real. On a large scale, to the extent that it affects our actions and our culture in a big way. I don't know that you could describe that as malicious. I believe that most people who are promoting exoteric religion are doing so in an entirely sincere and genuinely positive way. And I believe that they believe that they're doing good through that. And I also believe that sometimes they are indeed doing good through that. But at the same time, they are separating us from our parent being our real parent, not our imagined parent. They're attaching us to our imagined parent, but our real parent being nature, the thing that we have incontrovertible evidence that gave birth to us, nature and the natural world. The amount, if you thought of it in those terms, in a court of law, you went into a court of law and you wanted to compare the evidence in a completely impartial way that nature gave rise to us, versus another theory of where we came from. I don't think that if you had a completely impartial jury, I don't think that it would be a very long trial, frankly, or a very long case. The evidence is titanic that we came from nature, and it's understood in minute detail, absolutely minute detail in a non-religious sphere. But the the issue with that word religion. Shamanism is religious, but it's religious in a way of a spiritual relationship between human beings and nature, rather than a spiritual relationship between human beings and an imaginary supreme being. Yeah, and that's the real difference. But in both cases, you could describe it as spiritual. And in some ways, I feel that shamanism is more spiritual, not less spiritual than the things that the average person on the street might refer to as religion. And the absolute foundational base of that is Chalicity.
What I think could be, and we've mentioned that, I think you mentioned it in a podcast at some point, but it would be nice to explore the creation myths of many religions and what that means as far as shamanism
There are
goes.
no end of podcasts we could do, Joe. And that's another one for our miasma podcast, isn't it?
It is, isn't it? And I think it's a good one to explore. I mean, I know from my point of view, that's what kind of an aspect of what drew me into it anyway. It was quite interesting. Anyway,
well, we definitely do that. The question is just when and in the great sequence. When we start, interestingly, when we started out on this process, I remember when we talked about this kind of thing, we sort of jokingly said we'll never run out of things to talk about.
No, I feel like we've barely scratched the surface. I feel like I feel that. I mean, I'm interviewing you. You must.
Yeah. Well, we have
so
barely
much
scratched the surface, but that doesn't mean that the stuff that we've talked about to date or we covered today isn't important. We've barely scratched the surface, but one of the things that one of the parts of, in terms of the totality of shamanism, but one of the parts that we put probably a fairly heavy scratch into is Chalicity, which is, there's nothing more important than that in learning to be a shaman. There are more important things than that in being a shaman, but there's nothing more important than that in learning to be a shaman.
Cool. Right. I have a question here from a keen and avid listener who's emailed in and wanting your help. He has got to, I presume it's a he, I don't know his name or her name, but I presume he's got to the episode 8 at least, which is the episode on Toshal Teen.
Yeah.
And I think at the beginning of that one, you're talking about the Tilling exercise. So he's saying, please, can you verify that I have this procedure correct? So this is an explanation of what he believes the exercise to be. Stand with an open posture in the folded wing position, which is wrists crossed directly in front of the body. As the in-breath builds, turn left and spread your arms. Turn right, continuing to breathe in and return to the center. Raise your arms and embrace the sky, then collect the energy, he says, and return to the folded wing position. Repeat by turning to the right, continue alternating sides.
Yeah, that's a great description. Yeah.
Cool.
All I would say is that if you can, with all of these, because that Tilling is a technique, it's not an exercise. Yeah. It's a sort of crossover, Well, the ones where technique has a purpose. Okay. Technique always has a purpose. And within Tilling, there is a purpose.
Well, I'm going to stop you there because I believe this is going to come up. There's another part to this question, or another few parts to this question.
Okay.
These are the interesting ones. Is there a recommended time that a beginner should practice this set?
I don't like that word set, but anyway. It sounds very martial artsy to me, but yeah, the thing is that the recommended time is if you are having serious problems with your Chalicity, then don't push yourself because it won't help. It won't help. You have a rest, do something else, practice another technique. On the other hand, if sometimes you might be having a good day and your Chalicity might be going really well, then don't stop yourself. Do you follow what I mean?
Yeah.
These things stop naturally. So the only time you should really consciously stop yourself is if you're having real problems with your Chalicity and it's not really working very well. Maybe you're having a bad day. Then in that case, just do something else. Have it go with a different technique.
Yeah.
But when you're in we use that word flow, right? Yeah. When you're in the flow, when everything's going great and sometimes it just does, then enjoy it, and sometimes, what I would say is, for instance, we're telling, sometimes I don't want to stop. Yeah. There's a joy in this stuff. what'll typically happen is if I start doing tilling, I'll just come, I won't stop. It'll just turn into spirit dance. It's not that I'll start introducing variations. The satel naturally introduces variations. And for instance, when you spread your hands, I turn to the left, I spread my arms, and I turn back to the right. But sometimes, as the spirit takes me, as the satel takes me, sometimes I'll delay the spreading. Or sometimes there'll be a little wheel in it, there'll be a little eddy or current or something like that. But the point is, I'm not introducing that stuff. That's just stuff's coming out.
Yeah.
And introducing it is a bad idea. So what you'll find as you practice these exercises, stroke techniques more, all of them, not just Booking Hengrig as well, no different. Yeah. You will find that nature naturally makes variations in what you do. For tilling, we haven't really covered, we covered tilling as an exercise for Chalicity, but actually we haven't covered it as a technique for Amskar yet.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to go into. I wanted to talk to you about that.
There's another episode, mate. Yeah. We're already half an hour into this one. You said you want to keep it short.
It's not going that way.
There were a couple of other techniques, that I would like to introduce ahead of that. Particularly one called Homiluch, which I think is quite fundamental to Amskar. The ones that we've done, I think we've done Delgach and we've done Booking Hengrig. I think that's right.
Yeah.
So there's one called Homiluch, which I want to do a full episode on. And I think that the tilling as it relates to Amskar, rather than tilling as it relates to Chalicity, will become the Homiluch practice of the Homiluch technique will give some insight into tilling for Amskar. I remember if I gave that exercise as an opposite way, as an alternative way to practice Chalicity, but I did say it's an Amskar exercise. But just, we haven't really discussed the Amskar side of things. And I think the thing that's in tilling that makes it an Amskar technique will be a lot easier to understand once we've got through the much more pure Amskar Homiluch technique.
Well, we'll do that next episode then.
Yeah, cool.
Whichever one that is, I've lost count now.
I don't know either.
We'll work it out. So he's saying this sounds very much. He's saying this sounds like a Qigong sequence. If it's different, what is the focus of the exercise? Now, I think that the focus is not to have a focus, i.e. it's the focus as far as you've told us to
get rid of your focus.
Chalicity. It's to get rid of the focus, get rid of the judgment,
get rid of your focus, get rid of your Chinese miasma.
And would you say the repetitive motion of these movements is purely just like banging the drum or moving left and moving right? When we're practicing it in a Chalicity. Also, I can answer that question in a completely different way, which relates to the miasma, is that you will, I spent a bit of time in China, and as you know, I've spent a lot of time with native Chinese teachers in my life, a lot of time. Yeah.
We're talking decades, Chinese and Japanese. You go from one person to another in Qigong circles, one teacher to another in Qigong circles. You will get a very, very different view on what Qigong means and what its purpose is, going from one person to another, even in China. I mean, even among people who are knowledgeable in Qigong. You go from one shaman to another in terms of the breath. You will get different words used. You'll get different... You might get shown different variations on the exercise, but in terms of the purpose, you won't get any difference. Yeah, so there's the difference between shamanism and Qigong. Qigong can be anything, can't it? And I think another thing that's worth saying, I don't know, again.
Well, it means energy work, doesn't it? It's quite simply, it just means energy work.
Yeah, and also... shamanism is ancient, Qigong, we didn't want to do a martial arts podcast. I also don't want to do a Qigong podcast. All I'll say is Qigong is way more modern than most people think it is. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay. You don't want to open that kind of words.
But go back to even the 19th century and try and find somebody who's even heard of Qigong. That would be a challenge. Yeah.
I do want to give a little bit of a shout out to the person who sent the question in, though, because, he's doing it. He's listening to the podcast. He's going out and he's doing it. He's applying it. And
of course,
the more you do, the more you understand, the more experience you build. So, it's not going to happen overnight. So, I don't think it happens with anybody overnight, but at the end of the day, he's listening to the podcast and he's applying what we're trying to teach, which I think is fantastic.
I agree.
Yeah. So just to recap then, for Chalicity, Tilling is purely and simply, it's a rhythmic exercise in order to occupy or get rid of the thoughts, basically, or something simplistic to focus on whilst we're doing the exercise. And it's something physical, so it's getting us off our baseline anyway. It's getting us onto the midline.
But it is an energy exercise, right? It's an exercise. It involves changing energy. So if you take the Chinese word Qigong, in its literal sense, working with energy, then not only is Tilling a Qigong exercise, but so is Buching Hendrik.
Yeah.
Because that's working with energy. And so is every other technique in the whole of shamanism. If you literally translate Qigong, but the problem with that word is that the people who use it tend not to literally translate it. There tends to be a lot of miasma attached to their use of that word. And what I'm saying is, if they get rid of all the Taoist baggage and the Chinese cultural baggage and the modern Chinese take on life baggage and seeing the past through through various lenses of the present and previous generations, the rewriting of history, all that kind of stuff. If you take all that kind of stuff away and you just leave what's left in Qigong after you got rid of all of that stuff, then, hey, there's
shamanism.
Yeah, exactly. And where did that kind of thing come from? Daoyin. Where did that Daoyin being something that was genuinely old, unlike Qigong, and in Neigong, internal work. Well, there would be a difference. The word in Neigong, there would be a difference because internal work, Amskar, you could say, is internal work, but it never is purely internal in shamanism. We just use Amskar as a door, right, as a way in. Shamanism is very much external work. Yeah.
Cool. To finish this podcast off, I've got a personal question for you. One from me to you. I know this podcast isn't about personal development, so we very rarely touch on that. But have you found through your practice of Chalicity and ability to focus in your everyday life, massively improved concentration, or is that something you just don't particularly think about anymore?
Empirically speaking, I would say I'm in a line of work that I wouldn't be able to be in if it wasn't for my practice of shamanism. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know. I think the line of work that I'm in is far more interesting than the one I would have been in if I hadn't encountered shamanism. Am I able to focus? It depends what you mean by focus. Like, again, there's another one there's another whole podcast for the Miasma podcast, the English word focus and what it means. Cause, I think that just like everything, just like a lot of things, that there are two different things that we mean by focus. Can I do things that I wouldn't have been able to do without that? Absolutely, I can. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But focus, another word I would like to stay off if I possibly can.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I was thinking because,
focus is something you want to get away from. Yeah. If you're learning Chalicity, focus is something you want to get away from. Yeah.
The only reason I ask is it's working with getting rid of our judgments, getting rid of our opinions and stuff. And as a side effect of that, I was thinking that your life, your ability to absorb, your ability to enjoy life and just absorb everything around you and be able to learn things and concentrate on things would improve
dramatically. As you know, do I ever enjoy life? Do I ever? But that's not the purpose of shamanism. It's a side effect. You could even call it an unintended side effect. But do I ever, man? Yeah. Let's use a historical example. Stay off me.
Yeah.
One of the really interesting things with we mentioned Genghis Khan, Miss Chinggis Khan, who did something after thousands of years that seemingly nobody was able to achieve, although the potential for that had always been there. That was to unite the steppe tribes in what we would now call Mongolia and Siberia. You know, the if you like, the modern, what's seen as the modern homeland of shamanism.
Yeah.
To unite all of the steppe tribes under one banner, and then to push out from there to conquer China and found the Yuan dynasty. Him and his immediate successors, down to his grandson Kublai. To push out into the west to conquer Persia and establish, and Russia, although it wasn't called Russia in those days, to establish, for instance, the Golden Horde, very, very long-running Mongol originalist dynasty in Russia. Likewise with the Ilkhanate in Persia. They pushed into India. They defeated huge armies in Europe. They actually won a lot of loyalty. Not some Eastern European countries. Georgia was actually one of the most loyal countries to the Mongol Empire. You would never have thought that, would you? They had loyalty to someone who theoretically wasn't from their religion. Although, as you know, one of the upsides of Genghis, he had some downsides, but one of the upsides was he supported and protected the religions of all of his people. You know, he was very, very animistic. And that's what happens when exoteric religions encounter animistic peoples. It's to animistic peoples, religion is not a club where you have to join one religion or another religion. It's a welcoming thing. It's nature, and it's nature's parental, caring, embracing relationship to all life. And so one of the things I think that surprised people about him, but my point is that he achieved something that nobody else had been able to achieve, including Attila the Hun, going back over 1,000 years earlier, which was to create a long-running empire out of that seemingly small disparate bands of pastoralists and hunters. Incidentally, his family, they were actually hunter-gatherers, although they were living in an area dominated by pastoralists. The original family of Chinggis Khan were actually hunter-gatherers. They were on the extreme northern side of the steppe, pushed up against the taiga forests. So they behaved very like the Venki. But what I'm coming to is what was the contemporary explanation of the Mongols around him for why he was able to achieve that when nobody else could? The titanically powerful Khans, none of them were able to achieve that. And there were a couple of reasons. One of them was that he accepted everybody as his family. In an area, in a culture, the pastoral culture, in which family was the most important thing. Your brothers are the people you can trust, and nobody else you can trust. Whereas he trusted people based on their ability and their loyalty, very animistic, rather than the miasmatic approach, which is, this guy's my uncle, therefore I can trust him and not anybody else, kind of thing, And there's these family feuds going on. He got rid of all of that simply by promoting. So what happened when previous tribes, like the Tatars and the Naimans and people like that, they conquer another people, they make them slaves. Genghis Khan promoted some of those people to the highest ranks of office in his court, and his grandson did so too, famously Marco Polo. He promoted a guy from effectively what would be modern day Italy, Venice, and also people from Genoa. He promoted those people to the very highest levels of his administration, and this is an animistic attitude. And I believe that comes from the fact that the Mongols, who are a tiny little tribe, unlike most of the tribes around them who were pastoralists, were actually hunter-gatherers on the extreme northern end when they started out. So that's one reason. But why did the Mongols themselves attribute this ability to do this when nobody else had? They accused him of being a shaman. And that's why it's called the secret history of the Mongols and not the history of the Mongols. They believed that he was a shaman. And that's what enabled him to do this. When, people are probably aware, I don't know how much people know about the history of Genghis Khan, but he started off life, very early in life, before he was an adult, he was a slave. He was made a slave, and he rose from being a slave to being the ruler of the biggest empire the world has ever seen. Some of the methods he employed, you would say, were not that savory. But which empire builder ever employed savory methods? But you would say that by the standards of his day, he was quite what people would describe as fair. And he also, one of the problems he had is he was quite a clever guy. He used, just like modern esotericists do myth making, he used myth making as a tool of war. So the general idea was, rather than bringing an army to defeat a city, he was much more esoteric than that. He sent loads of rumors about what he'd done to previous cities, if they didn't surrender. And then when he showed up, a lot of them just surrendered. So this circumventing a lot of bloodshed, But the bottom line is the people around him, the Mongols, the animists around him, they accused him of being a shaman. And of course he did defeat Teptengur, the greatest, who's considered to be the greatest, most powerful shaman of, most people would consider him a black shaman or an evil shaman, but the greatest ever shaman of the Mongols, Teptengur, and Genghis Khan defeated him. So talking about rather than what I can do with my shamanism, there's what Genghis Khan could do with his shamanism. It made him a very, very effective individual because he was a hunter-gatherer and not a pastoralist. It made him incredibly effective in relation to the people around him. And you can say that which other member of an obscure tribe that nobody's ever heard of, starting off life as a slave, ever did that? Uneducated, supposedly, except in animism and shamanism. Whoever did that, and the list of things that fell out of that, that guy effectively created the modern world. But now we're going to end up in a podcast on history rather than on shamanism. And you see that shamanism is such a wide-ranging subject.
Colossal.
You just end up getting dragged into everything, and you end up with needing 700 podcasts, not one,
Or one with many, many downtimes and a few uptimes.
But a lot of times, the point I'm coming to is a lot of times where somebody would have expected him. Yeah. He captured one of his rivals, if you like. He captured a rival and people would have expected him to execute that person. He actually promoted them based on that and gave them a high ranking position in his, if they were useful and they had ability, and that's his pragmatic nature coming through. He was very, very pragmatic, like all hunter-gatherers have to be.
Fantastic. Well, let's wrap this episode up now. I think it's been an ever so slightly shorter than normal episode now. It's not a short episode anymore, but I think it's been fun. It's been a good episode, this one. It's like I wanted this one to be a solid clarification, so to speak, of what Chalicity is, so that when people do apply the practical stuff and they go out and do it, there's less confusion there. And
Sure.
So I think we've achieved that. Head on over to the website, guys, wovenenergy.com. You find all the blog posts over there. Everything's organized. Please share the blog posts if you can, and leave some comments if you can as well. Be really appreciated. Let's spread this podcast as far and wide as we can. If you're in this episode now already, you know this is the real stuff. This is the good stuff. So really, it'd be really good and help us out a lot. So yeah, I look forward to more to come. We're kind of halfway through stage 2 at the moment, so we'll continue with that. And but yeah, this episode's all been about Chalicity, so practice your Chalicity like mad, and we'll see you next episode.
Thanks, mate.